My name is Deborah Elms. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center out of Singapore and also President of the Asia Business Trade Association. Both organizations work with companies and governments to design better trade policy for Asia and then ultimately design better trade policy for the globe. Well, partly because we don't have any consistent global rules that govern digital trade. We don't have rules on data issues. We have very limited consistent rules on digital delivery of services. We have only some rules that cover e-commerce goods trade in the cross-border space. We're lacking intellectual property rights rules that apply to the digital era. So because we don't have global rules that bind governments in certain ways to rule on these issues consistently, we end up with a growing sense of regulatory fragmentation, which is captured very nicely in this report, where we have all kinds of inconsistent policies on how we deal with data, how we deal with personal privacy, sector-specific privacy concerns, how we deal with e-commerce goods trade, whether or not we allow digitally delivered services, how we manage those services once they arrive, and especially in terms of taxes and tariffs and so forth. What we do about intellectual property rights protections varies. The way we handle competition in the digital space is different. So there are a growing set of inconsistent regulations that are developing as governments try to manage a rapidly evolving digital landscape without having clear and consistent global rules in place. Always think about digital rules in particular from the perspective of smaller companies. So imagine that you are trying to be a micro multinational. So sit in your living room or garage or front lawn and deliver goods or services to anyone, anywhere, which was the promise of the digital revolution. When you try to do that in the cross-border space, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so because you face very rapidly, if you try to sell goods, inconsistent rules on trade in goods, inconsistent provisions about what kind of paperwork you're required to have, whether or not you have to pay taxes or tariffs or both on your products. What is the labeling and appropriate labeling laws, the testing requirements for certain kinds of products? If you deliver services, increasingly you are caught by different and inconsistent licensing and qualification rules, whether or not you have to have a presence on the ground, whether you need a tax ID in different markets in order to deliver services into that market. How do you manage the brand once you do cross-border trade? How do you deal with trademark challenges, patent problems? I mean, the list just multiplies. And many of these hit the smallest firms the hardest because they are completely caught unaware by inconsistent regulations. They assume, I think as you might if you were also running a small business, you assume that trade or business rules look the same in every market. And then you are often horrified to discover that actually they're quite different in different markets. And they might be quite different even with your neighbor. And even ironically enough, sometimes when you sit on the border and can literally see into your neighbor, you may find yourself at risk from different regulatory policies that lead to huge costs, sometimes fines and penalties for non-compliance with the rules, and real challenging operations that completely erode your profit margins and make it so that you actually lose money for every overseas customer that you thought that you had gained. I think the smaller firms are the most impacted, and actually consumers as well. But typically when we discuss digital fragmentation, we talk about large multinational firms and especially about digital firms. But I think it's important to remember that they are important, of course, but they're not the only actors in the ecosystem that are affected by fragmentation or by regulation in general. So I think it's critical actually to think about, what does this do for smaller firms? What does it do for customers? And if I were to point at some of the more obvious examples of fragmentation, that can be quite damaging. Some of them are obvious, lots of different rules around data, data flows, data hosting, data privacy. But I'm going to mention one that actually may not even be picked up in the database that you have collected, that nonetheless is critically important to both customers and to small businesses, which is something called a de minimis. So in e-commerce, it used to be the case that there was a level, a small level, but a level under which you had to pay no duties or tariffs, no customs paperwork, and potentially not taxes as well, VAT or GST on your goods. Increasingly, especially here in Asia, first of all, we have inconsistent levels of de minimis. It could be as high as $1,000. It could be as tiny as literally, at one point it was 13 pesos in the Philippines, which is, I think, less than a penny. So completely inconsistent de minimis levels. But increasingly now governments, especially in a quest for revenue, have squashed the de minimis down to potentially zero. So what does that mean then for a firm? If I want to export a product, so let me just pick one that a firm, this happens to be a small business that we work with that sells essential oils. You want to send an essential oil or something like it. Essential oils, unfortunately, you can't actually ship because they're considered a dangerous item, but we'll pretend that you can ship this. If the de minimis level, you're not shipping 40-foot containers. You're a small business. What are you shipping? One bottle. So you stick it in an envelope, you stick it in a package, you ship it across a border. And the problem with the de minimis level is the company that was selling this essential oil had no idea that they were suddenly going to have to pay tariffs, which can be very high actually on essential oils or candles or lotions or soaps. A tariff on some of those products across Asia could be 20, 25, 35%. I mean, remember that the profit margin on this bottle might only be 4%. So suddenly, not only have you lost your profit, but you are now minus 20% just on the tariffs. But you also then have to fill out customs paperwork, which you didn't even know existed. You have to try to figure out how to deal with the GST or VAT for your customer who purchased that. And at the end of the day, you are so negative revenue on the sale of this one bottle of essential oil that you then vow you shall never do cross-border trade again. So this issue of de minimis is a real problem for small businesses because the de minimis level set too low, and again, many times it's set to literally $1, $1.50, means that even relatively inexpensive products that are made by small businesses cannot be exported because it just simply stops their profitability and they just can't continue to support that kind of effort. So if you want to encourage small businesses to export, and if you want to encourage consumers and other firms to import a range of products, especially to support small businesses, to encourage rural entrepreneurship, to encourage women-owned companies, then you have to allow these smaller businesses an opportunity to engage in this kind of, again, really tiny, small cross-border trade of, a bottle of oil, a candle, some tea bags, whatever it happens to be, but something small enough that they suddenly find themselves affected by this de minimis rule. That's an example, in my view, of inconsistent regulation in the digital or e-commerce space that is incredibly damaging to small businesses. And they often find themselves caught because the last time that they sold this bottle to this market, they had none of that. And then when they sell it to the neighboring market, they suddenly find that the de minimis is different. And they try to sell to a third market, and again, it's different. And so they can't even say, well, what's the consistent level of de minimis? If it was consistent, let's imagine $25 or $50, could be higher, but let's just start with that. Then at least the small businesses would know, and consumers would know what the bill will be when the product comes. But this inconsistency is deeply damaging to the trade and export opportunities for businesses. Without information, then you're flying blind. So you are assuming that others regulate things the same way that you do, even though you know that that's probably untrue. You don't have the time and you don't have the resources to be able to check on what are your neighbors, and even worse, what are further away neighbors actually doing in the space. And so if someone's not collecting that information for you, then in a way, it really is hopeless. It's down to sort of chance or luck. you happen to be at the same event, you happen to be at the same conference, you're in the same, senior officials meeting where someone mentions what they're intending to do, and you realize, oh my goodness, now we have a problem, we're out of alignment. But absent that, there aren't a lot of places where we can get this information or share this information. We don't tend to bring together many of the regulators that apply to digital trade into the same space or the same room, and we don't do that often enough. And so then again, it's more ignorance and just lack of information that creates all sorts of problems. So the first step to fixing that is to get together as much information as you can, because these trade officials and regulatory officials of all kinds are also time and resource constrained. They have, depending on where you are, they could have hundreds of meetings in a year at the international level that they might have to attend. They may have multiple meetings internally within different government agencies and ministries. They don't have a lot of time themselves to figure out what are their own policies, and they certainly have no time left over to figure out what is anyone else's policies. I would make is we're never going to have perfection. So there are governments who are sitting on the sidelines, I would argue, while they wait for all of the data to come together, all of the best practice information, all of the various elements that come together to create the ideal digital trade policy agenda. And I think that's a mistake. We can't wait for everybody to have all the information they need, all of the resources they need, all of the capacity building they want, all of the digital divide squashed to zero. I mean, there's no way to achieve perfection. So the first point is you need to act before you have everything that you would ideally like in place. The second is that global is better. The more that we can have consistent rules across the largest imaginable number of governments and markets, the better it is. So keep working on global rules. But if that remains stuck, then at the least try to create some kind of consistent rules in the regional areas, in even bilateral areas. Do it however you have to. If you need to anchor it in a free trade agreement, do so. If you need to make an independent digital agreement, do so. If you need to have a cooperation commitment in order for your regulators to have an excuse to sit down together and share information, do that. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that we could minimize the fragmentation, but we have to start. We have to make it as big and as inclusive as possible, because that's much easier. And then you have to solve this in a variety of different ways. Now, unfortunately, because I can already hear people saying, but doesn't that sound more fragmented? If you're saying do this in whatever format works, aren't you going to make the situation worse? It's possible. It's possible it will actually be more problems, because now we will have different groupings creating different and inconsistent regulatory policies, which is, again, why we need the global to work best. But given that we haven't seen any action from the global community really on anything related to digital trade since 1995, when the World Wide Web first became public, it's very hard to imagine how much longer that will take. So in the meantime, my preference is get started on something. Try to be as integrated as possible. Try to get information about what your neighbors are doing. And again, my deepest respect for this kind of initiative that you're working on, because without that information, then you're just guessing at what you think the right policies should be, and policies that you think won't be conflictual with others. But if you don't know what their policies are, then of course we're running into a complete disaster. So having the information, trying to create alignment, trying to create consistency, a commitment up front to cooperate, very useful, and then actually delivering on the ground results that benefit businesses. So you have to, as always, talk to companies about what is it they're trying to do, what is it that they can't do, and why. So this de minimis problem, for example, comes about because governments actually don't understand how or why de minimis makes a difference to small businesses. So, and you can't just go to a small business and say, hey, tell me please how de minimis makes a difference to you, because a small business will say, I don't even know what you're talking about. I've never heard of this word. So you have to be very careful about how you ask these questions, but at the end of the day, it matters. And so the practical on the ground feedback from companies that are trying to do things is super important in creating policies that solve the most pressing issues for companies.